Well, there have been mounting calls for the Southern African Development Community, SADC, and the African Union to intervene in Zimbabwe, where human rights abuses are said to be taking place. Both the regional and continental body have often resisted acting harshly against member states who step out of line. Well, to discuss this further, I'm now joined via Skype by foreign policy analyst Sanusha Naidu from the Institute for Global Dialogue, and also the president of 55 states, Dr. Charles Sinkala, who joins us via Zoom. To both of you, thanks very much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Good evening, Peter. Thank you. And
the viewers.
All right, let me start with you, Sanusha. And let's talk about Zimbabwe, because that's really what's in focus, but I think it speaks to quite a number of issues ultimately. The first is President Ramaphosa tried his best to do something, sent envoys, but they came back literally empty-handed after maybe perhaps having a cup of tea with the president. What do you make of that? Does it point to the fact that countries on the continent can act with impunity?
I think what to you that countries don't take the continental government seriously. They don't assume that there's a need for these institutions to play a critical role when there's a regional spillover when it comes to instability. And what happened with the two envoys that President Ramaphosa sent to meet the ZANU-PF leader and the leader of the Republic of Zimbabwe was to actually look at this whole situation with a lack of any kind of attempt to understand the seriousness of it, but also with disdain. And you're quite right to say that it's with impunity, because it seems to me that the institutions are not necessarily seen as having that kind of ability to intervene, to say to leaders, listen, you've been reckless, you're being errant, you're being basically, you're committing human rights violations against your own people. But this is an age-old problem. It's not just the AU. I think we've had this situation in the continent and in Southern Africa for a while now. Whether we want to call it a post-liberation struggle question, whether you want to call it a governance question, the problem here is that leadership in the region and across the continent just don't see how important institutions are. And of course, what that does is that it makes these institutions, these regional institutions, become almost invalid in their mandate. And that, I think, is what is really sad, because we have all these charters, we have all these institutions to protect the human rights, we have the African People's Court of Human Rights and Justice, all of these things that are supposed to protect the individual, the citizen, etc., but it's just not taken seriously.
Dr. Sinkala, you were quite disappointed with the envoys coming back, and I know that you've been writing letters and trying to get attention from the leaders.
Yes, it's quite disappointing, Pira, you know, that you can send the two envoys with the expenses of taxpayers' money just to go listen to the rhetoric, political dynamics in Zimbabwe. It is actually shocking, you know. We needed a delegation which will go to Zimbabwe and they have the both parties mediated together. But it is very shockingly that the envoys only met the ZANU-PF as a party, and they met the government of Emmerson Mnangagwa on a separate note. And I think it is from those meetings that President Emmerson Mnangagwa demanded that the envoys should not meet the MDC. So their reporters come back very one-sided. You know, I give the time and again examples on family disputes as a marriage. You know, you can't just listen to the husband, you must listen to the wife as well for you to get what is the perspective, and they gauge them on where you have to meet them. And one other thing which we have to realize is the role the AU is playing in terms of mediating conflicts within Africa. We thought, having written to President Cyril Ramaphosa, who is the chairperson of African Union, that he will use his capacity as chair to take a delegation to Zimbabwe to involve other parties as well, to go and listen from both parties and come up with a solution that will work. But I see the bureaucratic system in the AU prevented him from using that avenue. As a result, he acted as president of South Africa to send the envoys.
All right, so let me come back to you, Sanusha. And I guess, you know, when I was busy reading up on the support structures that are in SADC in particular, let's start there. One notices straight away that in 2014, the SADC Tribunal's mandate was stripped of certain powers. Before individuals and organizations could come to the tribunal, and after several judgments, ironically against Zimbabwe, the tribunal's powers were stripped, and now it's really just settles disputes between countries. I suppose as far back as then, we already get an indication that they just don't have an appetite to police. Hello, Sanusha, are you there?
Yeah. I think that yeah, I'm here. You completely on point with the situation. Because again, it comes back to whether or not these institutions are taken seriously. I mean, you're right about pointing out around the SADC Tribunal, and after the SADC Tribunal and those judgments were made, we then saw the SADC Tribunal being disbanded, being essentially saying that, you know, it's about the fact that heads of state or leaders or political party or political leadership will actually deal with issues around how they'll sanction and essentially take action against each other. But that's never really in this whole process. The second thing is that we realize that we have these institutions, those are not really being effectively mandated in their terms, their objectives to deal with conflict. Whether we want to accept it or not, I think the problem here is that sovereignty takes precedence the institutional mandate of governance in the continent and I think to a large extent what my colleague said about the role of South Africa and the question of President Ramaphosa, I mean, I think to some extent there was this internally in the AU, there's been a rebuke against Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwean leadership, etc. But the question here is, do they really care? Do they think that these interventions are going to work? And you can see that they don't really feel that it's going to have an impact seriously. So again, we come thinking of other avenues, other options of how do we get these essentially used, I think even what is the lowest of low in terms of a COVID-19, the pandemic, to carry out these human rights abuses. How do we get them to, how do we change this kind of governance, a lack of governance, the recklessness of governance, and the fact that they act with complete disregard for the citizenry and the human rights of people? And I'm not sure what the option is and how we go forward, but it cannot be what we currently have.
All right, Dr. Sinkala, we've heard from the AU chair, Musa Faki Mohammed, and again, it's pleading to the Zimbabwean government. But that's about as much as they can do, is almost beg, please behave.
Yeah, it's a very unfortunately that the AU and me myself have been in contact with Dr. Kenneth Kaunda, the only surviving member of the Organization of African Unity. You know, is so disgraced that the agenda of the organization he met in 1957 in Ghana, which was conceived there and born in 1963 in Addis Ababa, where 32 heads of state signed an agreement that at that time Africans, they never had a system of governance. The only part of governance they had was through the chiefdoms and the kingdoms and the kings, but they never had the experience of governing the whole countries. That's why they created the Organization of African Unity, that this would be a watchdog. You know, many of the people have mentioned that AU is a toothless bulldog. That's why the dog issue and the analogy came in, that it will be a watchdog which will create a web, in the continent, and make sure that it presides and it trains people for governance, and it protects as well from imperialist involvement. And after that period of leaders, in Kwame Nkrumah died, and many others leaders came out of government, because these most leaders, they were actually part of ceremonial positions, because they intended that a different type of leadership will have to take a position of a watchdog. But because of the celebration of the independence, all these have been formed. AU now, as I'm speaking to you, is governed by the Assembly of Heads of State and Government, who are presidents, and they meet only once in a year. And from that, they have actually, in 1999 and 2002, they have changed the agenda of AU. They transformed it to African Union, which has adopted a system by the European Union of administration. So this time, they only do the administration of the countries. They are incapacitated. They cannot get involved into the conflict is happening in Africa. You see, United Nations, they are overlook them and intervene. They are in Nigeria, Central African Republic, DRC, to just perform that task. And the other problem which is there, which I mention all the time, is the appointment of presiding officers in AU. Like now, President Emerson Mnangagwa is a presiding officer on SADC organ of peace and security. You can't have a conflict of interest of such cases. But, we've talked about the AU, SADC region organization, and any other organization. They are not a kind of organization which are in a space of assisting Zimbabwe. Hence Africa 55 states, where I preside, we've got a mandate from AU. We are trying to enforce the negotiation and mediation from these countries and trying to resolve them from a perspective which is beyond the bilateral agreement of a sovereign state, because the countries through the AU cannot perform certain functions due to limitations in the agreements which they have signed. The case of Zimbabwe, it's an isolated case, where Zimbabwe has gone through the sanctions, and we are calling all African states that all 54 states, they can assist Zimbabwe, to in terms of government as well as money, whatever they need, the resources, to kickstart their economy. African countries must stand up, and the people of Africa, they must feel pain for the Zimbabweans, because Zimbabweans are not at peace. And this is a very good strategy that we have initiated to involve the people, because we can see that we cannot milk any milk from the grass, but we can feed the cow to the grass and milk the cow. Hence, Africa 55 states now is very robust in terms of dealing with this. AU, like what the chairperson has done, the CEO of AU, you can only say keep peace in Zimbabwe, but there's no actually peace to be kept there.
I'm going to move us along because we're running out of time. But Sanisha, I just want to come back to you as well. 2017, there was a toppling of a sitting government, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, and it seems as if the African Union, SADC, endorsed the coup by allowing it to play out.
Yeah, I think there'll be different interpretations of whether it was a coup or whether it was a removal of government through other means. But I think that the challenge here is then it tells you, Peter, that again, SADC allowed something that they realized that they could have no control over. They didn't succeed in the context of the Robert Mugabe regime. And so what happened in Zimbabwe and the internal political dynamic of Zimbabwe and how that played itself out in terms of the political power struggle and the removal of Robert Mugabe, I think SADC sat on the sidelines and said, let it happen, because we can't do anything or we can't exert any pressure. We couldn't do anything irrespective. And so we let it happen and let it happen internally. And I think to a large extent, that's the dilemma for most regional institutions and where if they can't necessarily find the maneuverability and flexibility to shape and shift and influence the internal dynamics within a political, the borders of a state, particularly appealing to the consciousness of their leadership, then they think that then of course they let something happen internally like they did in 2017. Unfortunately, I think sometimes you can't allow that to take its due course because the regional dynamic, the spillover effect, the humanitarian crisis, the migration issue, the fact that people their lives are being put at risk by their own government. You can't allow that to continue and hope that something internally will give and it'll change.
Dr. Sinkala, we've got many stories coming out of Zimbabwe at the moment, and I'll just pick one. A young woman who had nothing to do with anybody, but the police were looking for her brother. They didn't find him, and she was sexually abused. Her clothes were cut with scissors, and she was beaten. Where can she go to for help?
Peter, it's unfortunately, when I was in Zimbabwe on the weekend, there's no government there. There's no government you can point out. There's no rule of law, like what you likely said. The same police that she might report of her brother, will victimize her, and there's actually no system. I call it that it's on autopilot. That's why hence we urge the people to take Zimbabweans' case very seriously. We can only see on the social media what is happening, but it is a security risk for the Central Africa and as well as Southern Africa.
But where can she go? Where can she go? Where can she go and cry to?
There's actually nowhere to cry to. There's nowhere to cry to. I think the only way she can cry to is for the rest of the Africa, that Africans should hear and come to the party, to assist the Zimbabweans. The system there does not work. People are living on the street. People are staying in the ramshacks. There's no functional. There's no currency. There's nothing happening. And the President Mnangagwa is still holding on to power, thinking that he can change things. For the past couple of years, almost 3 years now, Zimbabweans had very high hopes of him turning around. Hence, we saw the national flag in his wearing it all the time. We thought he's trying to change things. His historic speech spoke to that. But we are seeing something differently of what President Mnangagwa, the crocodile, the coin of what he's doing.
Sanisha, so, I mean, is it a surprise then that people end up actually breaking the law, going onto the streets and violently taking back their power? Because it seems as if there are no other options.
Yeah, I think when you end up in a situation where your back is against the wall, where you can't even turn to the police for some kind of reprisal and to they are the personnel in the country that's supposed to protect you, and there's law and order, and you can't trust them. When the trust deficit gets to the point where you can't trust anybody, I think the only option is survival, and that survival is to take to the streets for your own survival, for your own humanity, and for your own salvation. And I think sometimes we want to appeal to the consciousness of a united set of principles and values, universal declaration of human rights and so forth. But when that is no longer a palpable way in which you can take your demonstration and protest in a peaceful way, where you're constantly being put at risk, your own livelihood, your own life is being put at risk, then of course I think we've seen this too many times in history, where people take to the streets and they turn into a reactionary force. And I think that's what we're going to be seeing if there's no immediate action taken.
Dr. Sinkala, perhaps a final word. I see ECOWAS often. I mean, they seem often to be able to take action. They were in a trip at, was it Libya just the other day? Mali, sorry, the other day, laying down the law. They take action. Why is ECOWAS able to take action and other regions perhaps not? And then perhaps finally as well, surely you just suspend these countries from the AU, from SADC. that will force them to behave. You wouldn't have to intervene in their countries, suspend Zimbabwe from the African Union. Why sit next to that president when they meet in Addis Ababa, as they did with Omar al-Bashir?
Yeah, Pira, it's quite unfortunate. Yes, ECOWAS, they know their duty and they know their objectives and they work towards that. The West African community as well, they are worked very closely in touch with the East African community and as well as the Maghreb from the north. And I'm happy to say that the 1952 France for the Francophone countries has been diffused, that that areas of the 14 African Francophone countries will no longer use the franc. You know, they are working towards doing something. It's unfortunate that this part of Southern Africa, where we have our Pan-African Parliament just close to 700 kilometers from Harare, Zimbabwe, where the things are happening, you know, that parliament has always been closed because they always meet once in a year. President Roger Gondo, you know, if you go there and knock the door, you want to see him, you're never going to see him. And this represents an organ of OAU. But to talk to what you have just said of sanctions, you know, sanctions really do not affect those purveyors of these atrocities and the inhuman treatment. These sanctions actually affect the ordinary people. And I wouldn't say sanctions has to be imposed on countries or removed from the Organization of African Unity, AU for that matter. You know, in fact, the AU needs the countries because they are paid, the money comes from member states. So they wouldn't even want to lose Zimbabwe because Zimbabwe is still paying to them. This also compromises their decisions and judgment. I think we need a more robust approach, you know, to sit with these countries. And if we have to condemn that President Mnangagwa has to resign, he has to resign.